Welcome to the Dynasty Files, where history speaks for itself. Tonight, we unravel one of the most devastating collisions in human history: the Opium Wars. How the world's wealthiest empire was brought to its knees, not by armies, but by a flower. The blind giant in a golden palace. In 1800, which nation was the wealthiest on Earth? Not Britain, not France. It was an empire that most Westerners had never set foot in. The Qing dynasty controlled nearly one-third of the world's total economic output. According to economist Angus Maddison, more than all of Europe combined. Nearly 300 million people lived under the dragon's shadow, stretching from the Gobi Desert to the tropical forests of Yunnan, from the steppes of Xinjiang to the coast of Fujian. The treasury overflowed. Rice was abundant. Silk and tea poured from trading ports like an inexhaustible spring. Built over 2,000 years of continuous civilization, this empire did not consider itself merely a nation. It considered itself the center of the universe. Tiansha, all under heaven. Everything beyond its borders was barbarism, darkness yet to be illuminated by the light of the Son of Heaven. That pride was not entirely unjustified. 3 emperors, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, had expanded the territory to its maximum extent. The economy flourished brilliantly. The population exploded from 150 million to nearly 300 million in just a century. The Kangxi-Qianlong Golden Age lasted over 130 years, longer than the entire history of the United States from the Declaration of Independence to World War I. This was the era when China truly was the world's economic center, where silver from every corner of the globe flowed inward like rivers to the sea. Qianlong, the longest-reigning, most powerful emperor, once sent King George III of Britain a letter that, if you read it today, would sound like a corporate executive addressing an intern applying for a job. The Celestial Empire possesses all things. It has no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for its own products. 4 words: we don't need you. That was 1793. Lord Macartney's mission, the first British diplomatic delegation to China, brought hundreds of gifts: astronomical clocks, telescopes, warship models, spring suspension carriages, the cutting edge of Western technology at the time. Qianlong glanced at them and called them curious tribute. He never bothered to understand how they worked. He never asked why the British Navy dominated every ocean. He simply bestowed upon George III an imperial decree, as if granting a favor from on high, then dismissed the delegation. Macartney left China with a chilling observation in his memoir. This empire is the largest man of war in the world, still afloat only through inertia. But when an incompetent captain takes the helm, she will sink. That prophecy proved terrifyingly accurate. But while the Qing dynasty slept atop its glory, on the other side of the globe, a transformation was occurring at breathtaking speed. Britain, an island 1/10 the size of Sichuan province, was trembling with the roar of steam engines. James Watt improved the steam engine in 1769. From that point, factories sprouted like mushrooms. Iron ships began cutting through oceans, independent of wind. Steel was forged into cannons of unprecedented destructive power. Manchester's textile mills produced fabric faster than 10,000 hand weavers combined. Railway tracks stretched across the British countryside, connecting cities to seaports, transforming a small island into the world's workshop and harbor. Think of it this way. If the Industrial Revolution was the greatest software update in human history, then the Qing dynasty was the only computer on the planet that refused to hit update. Not because the machine was broken, but because its owner believed the old software was already perfect. That complacency, born from genuine success, was the most dangerous poison of all, because the victim never knows they're being poisoned. Looking deeper into the Qing military at this point, the picture was even bleaker. The Banner Army, once the Manchu people's greatest pride, the force that conquered the entire realm, defeated the Ming dynasty, and unified China, had become nothing but a hollow shell. In Beijing, Banner soldiers spent most of their time raising songbirds, sipping tea in street cafes, and smoking tobacco pipes through lazy afternoons. Their horsemanship and archery, the martial essence of the Manchu identity, had deteriorated after decades of peace. Many Banner soldiers had to hire substitutes to shoot arrows on their behalf during military reviews because their arms lacked the strength to draw a bowstring. The weapons in their hands were still 17th century matchlock muskets, the kind requiring manual loading, lighting a fuse, and praying the wind wouldn't blow it out. Short range, accuracy dependent more on luck than skill. The coastal defense system was no better. Fortresses built from mud brick mixtures, topped with fixed cannons that couldn't rotate, capable of firing in only one direction. If an enemy ship moved to a different angle, the cannon became a useless lump of iron. Gunpowder was adulterated, propulsion so weak that cannonballs often splashed into the water before reaching enemy vessels. The entire military apparatus resembled a sandcastle, imposing to look at, but one large wave away from obliteration. The deeper problem lay in the structure of thought itself. The court confined all Western merchants to a cramped area in Guangzhou called the 13 Factories, 13 buildings along the riverbank outside the city walls. Foreigners were forbidden from entering the city, learning Chinese, bringing women, or moving freely. They could only trade through a privileged group of Chinese merchants called the Kohong. All communication with the court had to pass through the Kohong. No direct diplomatic channels existed. This was how the Qing controlled the outside world, not through understanding, but through isolation. Like using a blindfold to cope with darkness, when the blindfold comes off, the blinding light leaves you completely blind. The contrast between these two worlds was striking, like looking at two photographs taken on the same day, but centuries apart. On one side, the British Empire, representing mechanical power, free market thinking, and unlimited expansionist ambition. The empire on which the sun never set, controlling colonies on every continent, the Royal Navy commanding every ocean, factories churning out goods at unprecedented speed. On the other, the Qing dynasty, representing a Confucian order that had existed for over 2,000 years, static stability, and absolute faith in tradition. A self-sufficient agricultural economy where every need was met within the village or county, where international trade was dismissed as a lowly occupation. Two systems of thought that could not coexist on a shrinking planet. The collision between these two tectonic plates was not if, but when. And the catalyst for the explosion was not gunpowder. It was silver. The tea-silver paradox and the most ruthless invention in trade history. But there was one thing the Qing sold that drove the world mad: tea. The British were addicted to tea like they were addicted to oxygen. From the queen to the street sweeper, everyone drank it. Walk into any London tea house of the era, from aristocrats in elaborate ball gowns to coal miners covered in grime. Everyone held a cup of hot tea. Tea was not just a beverage, it was fuel for the Industrial Revolution. Tea kept workers alert through 14-hour shifts in steam-choked factories. Tea mixed with Caribbean colonial sugar, cheap, quick energy for the working class. Tea brewed with boiled water, inadvertently reducing disease spread through contaminated water sources in crowded cities. By the 1830s, Britain consumed millions of pounds of tea annually. Tea taxes accounted for 10% of total government revenue. If the tea supply were interrupted, the British government would be in crisis. But tea grew in only one place on Earth, China under the Qing dynasty. And the Chinese accepted only one thing in exchange: silver. Spanish silver dollars, minted from the silver mines of Mexico and Peru, flowed into British merchants' pockets and straight into the Qing imperial treasury. Silver flowed from London to Guangzhou like a waterfall, year after year, decade after decade. Picture the enormous East India Company trading ships leaving London with cargo holds empty of goods but loaded with heavy silver chests. When they returned, they were filled with tea, silk, and porcelain. But Britain's silver reserves were draining away. The British Empire, fresh from defeating Napoleon, master of the oceans, was hemorrhaging financially because of an afternoon cup of tea. And somewhere in the grey offices on Leadenhall Street, London, headquarters of the British East India Company, directors and government officials were searching for a commodity. Something the Chinese not only wanted, but needed. Something that would create constant, irresistible demand, capable of reversing the silver flow from China back to Britain. They found it in the brilliantly colored poppy fields of Bengal, India, Britain's most lucrative colony. From the sap of that flower, they manufactured the substance that would break an empire's spine: opium. Before opium flooded in, the Qing already had cracks from within. He Shen, Qianlong's favorite minister, was so corrupt that when his assets were confiscated, their total value equaled 15 years of imperial court revenue. The rot from the top spread to the very lowest levels. Levees went unrepaired. Floods became constant. The population grew too fast. Farmland couldn't feed everyone. Peasant uprisings began erupting in remote rural areas. The Qing was standing on a pile of dry kindling, waiting for a spark. And the British brought that spark aboard trading ships loaded with black mud. Before a single bullet was fired, the Opium War had already begun, on the pages of accounting ledgers. Forget the image of battlefield smoke and fire. The real story lies in the dry numbers that East India Company treasurers recorded every night by candlelight. What numbers? The deficit. In 1820, having defeated Napoleon and become the world's sole superpower, the British Empire faced an enemy that the Royal Navy couldn't sink: the trade balance sheet. The British needed tea to fuel the entire Industrial Revolution. Tea accounted for 10% of the national budget, but the Chinese didn't need anything from Britain. The British brought thick woolen cloth from Manchester. The Chinese looked at it with indifference. Why wear hot, heavy wool when they already had the finest silk and cool cotton? The British brought intricate mechanical clocks and complex optical instruments. The emperor and court officials treated them as exotic decorative toys, not essential goods. China was a perfectly self-sufficient economy. Everything from food to clothing to household items was produced locally. They didn't need the world, but the world craved everything they had. The result? British ships left London with bellies full of silver, returned loaded with tea, silk, and porcelain, but precious metal reserves were steadily draining. According to the mercantilist doctrine dominating Western economic thought at the time, a nation's wealth was measured by its gold and silver holdings. To have silver flowing out endlessly, that was slow economic suicide. Tea prices in Britain began soaring. If tea trade stalled, the British government would go bankrupt. If silver kept flowing out, the British financial system would collapse. A life or death equation with no solution. A solution was needed, and that solution had to be the perfect product, in the darkest sense possible. A customer who buys once would never stop buying. Opium, the money machine and the silent weapon of destruction. Opium met every criterion. It was cheap to produce. Indian farmers grew poppies on colonial land. The sap was harvested, concentrated, formed into fist-sized dark brown balls wrapped in dried leaves. It was light to transport. A chest of opium was worth 100 times its equivalent weight in any ordinary commodity. And most importantly, it was addictive. Once someone tried it, the human body became hostage to itself, willing to sell everything, house, land, dignity, for a single puff of smoke. The East India Company built an industrialized opium production system right in India. They forced millions of poor farmers to switch from growing food to growing poppies. At Patna and Ghazipur, enormous factories inspected each opium cake with frightening precision, ensuring the exact high calibrated for the Chinese market. No different from a modern tech corporation controlling product quality before market launch, except the product here wasn't a phone or a car. It killed people. They refined opium to suit Eastern tastes, packaged it carefully, and transported it on fast, lightly armed ships. A perfect supply chain, from the fields of Bengal to the opium dens of Guangzhou, designed with the cold professionalism of a multinational corporation. But selling opium in China was illegal. The court had issued decrees banning its import and use since the late 18th century. To avoid direct diplomatic trouble, the East India Company employed a scheme so cunning it bordered on genius. They didn't sell directly. They auctioned opium in Calcutta to independent traders, British, Parsi, Indian. These dealers used small, sleek, extremely fast boats equipped with light weapons to smuggle opium into the Chinese coast. On paper, the East India Company's hands were clean. In reality, they were the kingpin behind the entire operation. Like a corporate executive denying responsibility for the actions of independent contractors. The money flowed in a diabolical cycle, closed, ruthless, and terrifyingly efficient. British silver went to India to fund colonial administration and military. That silver purchased opium from the East India Company. Opium was smuggled into China in exchange for Chinese merchants and citizens' silver. That silver returned to British merchants in Guangzhou to buy tea and silk shipped back to London. A closed circle. China was losing silver, losing people, losing its soul. Britain solved its trade deficit, funded its Indian colony, got its tea, and reaped enormous profits. A perfect money machine, lubricated by the tears and blood of two colonized peoples. The entire supply chain was organized with a sophistication that would impress any modern business professor, if they could set aside the moral dimension. The money trail formed a diabolical cycle. Opium didn't just drain the treasury, it drained the vitality of an entire nation. Initially, opium was a luxury indulgence of the elite, imperial princes, high-ranking officials, wealthy merchants. Elegant smoking dens in major cities with ivory lamp tables, finely crafted bronze pipes, and attentive servants. But very quickly, faster than anyone predicted, the addiction spread to every class. From officers to foot soldiers, from merchants to dock laborers, from aristocratic women to street prostitutes. Opium didn't discriminate between rich and poor. It only needed a human body to parasitize. Squalid dens sprouted like mushrooms in every alley, opium smoke blanketing entire neighborhoods, its distinctive musty smell becoming a familiar scent of Chinese urban life. By 1830, the volume of opium smuggled into China had increased tenfold since the beginning of the century. Every year, millions of taels of silver left Qing borders in exchange for wisps of illusory smoke. The silver flow had completely reversed. Instead of flowing in as it had for centuries, silver was now hemorrhaging out. This was when macroeconomics became a micro-level social catastrophe, touching every family, every meal, every drop of a farmer's sweat. In the Qing financial system, people lived their daily lives using copper coins but paid taxes in silver. When silver became scarce due to the outflow, its value relative to copper skyrocketed. A farmer in Guangdong in 1800 only needed to exchange 1,000 copper coins for 1 tael of silver to pay taxes. By 1838, that same farmer had to spend 2,000 copper coins, double. Meanwhile, income from rice and sweet potatoes was still denominated in copper, unchanged. The effective tax burden had doubled, without the court issuing a single tax increase. An invisible tax, killing more silently than opium itself. Fields lay fallow, farmers were impoverished, levees went unrepaired, floods came, hunger followed. Simmering resentment burned like embers waiting to ignite. Peasant uprisings began erupting across remote regions. Pause for a moment. Picture an opium den in Guangzhou. Dim oil lamplight, smoke curling up from corroded bronze pipes. On wooden platforms, silk-robed officials lay beside sword-wearing soldiers, wealthy merchants shoulder to shoulder with laborers so gaunt they were skin and bone. Addiction leveled all classes. It made no distinction between noble and lowly. Everyone's eyes were vacant. Everyone's hands trembled. Soldiers couldn't hold their swords. Officials embezzled to fund their habit. Laborers sold their last clothes. An entire society being corroded from within, and the enemy carried no weapons. The enemy fit neatly inside a black wooden chest. In the Forbidden City, Emperor Dao Guang received increasingly alarming memorials. Millions were addicted, the exact number unknown. Historical sources vary wildly, from 2 million to 10 million, the discrepancy itself showing the court had completely lost control. The treasury was critically depleted, insufficient funds to maintain the military or repair levies. The army was weakened by addiction, the bureaucracy paralyzed by smuggling bribes. Even within the imperial household, princes wasted away before opium lamps. It is said that Dao Guang witnessed his own son withering from the black smoke, the pain of a father, multiplied 10,000 times because he was also the father of an empire. Meanwhile, half a world away in London, the picture was completely reversed. William Jardine, a former ship's surgeon, nicknamed the Iron-Headed Old Rat for his ruthless coldness in business, and his partner James Maddison, sat counting profits in their comfortable offices on King William Street. Jardine Matheson and Company, a trading conglomerate that still exists today, operating globally with revenues in the tens of billions of dollars, began as Asia's largest opium trading empire, controlling most of the black mud flowing into China. History has dark ironies. The corporation built on crime still thrives, while millions of victims have turned to dust. When addiction spread beyond control, the demand for silver to buy opium surged, creating a destructive spiral. Addiction leads to silver demand. Silver scarcity drives up its price. Heavier taxes burden the poor. Social instability worsens. Deeper corruption allows more opium to flow in, and addiction spreads further. The spiral accelerated every day until the entire system exploded. By 1838, the situation had reached emergency levels. At the Forbidden City, a heated debate raged. The progressive faction proposed legalization. The conservative faction demanded suppression. In December, Emperor Dao Guang appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with absolute authority. He chose the most incorruptible man in the empire, nicknamed Lin the Clear Sky, and charged him with the empire's heaviest mission: to eradicate the opium plague at its root. Lin Zexu and the 23 days that shook the world. March 1839. Guangzhou held its breath. Word of Lin Zexu's arrival spread faster than the sea breeze, from riverside tea houses to the trading offices inside the 13 factories. This was no ordinary official, the kind who takes office and then opens the back door for smuggler bribes. This was Lin the Clear Sky, a man the entire empire knew could not be bought, threatened, or deceived. Lin Zexu arrived in Guangzhou on March 10th. 54 years old, with a resolute face and sharp, cold eyes that concealed the calm of a Confucian scholar who had studied the classics his entire life. He came not with grand ceremonies or an extravagant entourage. He came with a mission heavier than Mount Tai: to sever the opium lifeline at any cost. Within days, he issued an ultimatum that sent shockwaves through the 13 factories. Within 3 days, all opium aboard foreign trading vessels must be surrendered to the imperial government. Furthermore, every merchant must sign a bond permanently swearing never to bring opium into China again. Violators? Cargo confiscated. Ringleaders face the death penalty. This was a cultural and legal shock to the British. In 19th century Western thinking, private property was sacred, arguably more sacred than human life in many cases. Opium, though a poison, was still considered legitimate merchandise by William Jardine, James Maddison, and the trading class, private property protected by law. 3 days passed. Nobody surrendered anything. Lin Zexu acted, and his actions were without precedent. He ordered a complete blockade of the 13 factories. Thousands of soldiers and war junks sealed every exit. All Chinese servants, cooks, and interpreters were forced to leave immediately. 350 Western merchants, including British diplomatic officials, were trapped inside their own quarters. Food and fresh water were cut off. Lin Zexu didn't use guns. He used isolation, and it broke the enemy's will more effectively than any cannon. Charles Elliot, British Chief Superintendent of Trade in China, made a fateful decision. He requested that merchants surrender all opium to him in the name of Queen Victoria's government. This transformed the opium from private property into British national property. When Lin Zexu confiscated it, he was no longer confronting a few smugglers. He was confronting the British state itself. But Lin Zexu didn't care, or didn't realize. His only goal? Sweep away the black mud. A total of 20,283 chests of opium were surrendered. Lin Zexu chose Human, a town at the mouth of the Pearl River, as the site of execution. He didn't burn it, smart enough to know that opium smoke in the air would intoxicate the surrounding population, and resin soaking into the ground could be dug up later. He needed a thorough method. June 3, 1839, a date that would enter Chinese history as a symbol of defiance and also the beginning of tragedy. On the beach at Human, 3 enormous trenches were prepared. Opium chests were opened. The black balls were sliced, thrown into trenches. Seawater was channeled in through canals. Salt and quicklime were added. The chemical reaction erupted violently. The pits boiled and churned, acrid white smoke billowing upward. Workers used large poles to stir continuously until the opium dissolved completely into useless sludge. When the tide went out, sluice gates opened, flushing the entire toxic mixture into the open sea. Lin Zexu stood on a raised platform, observing with a stern expression. He invited foreign merchants, missionaries, and local residents to witness, wanting the world to see that China was no longer a sick patient to be bullied. And he did something quintessentially Lin Zexu. He wrote a prayer to the sea god, apologizing for polluting the ocean, but explaining this was necessary to save human lives. A small detail, but it revealed everything about the man. An official both unyielding and conscientious, so rare as to be nearly alone in the entire imperial bureaucracy. 23 days and nights. Over 1,000 tons of opium vanished into nothing. This was the most brilliant moral victory the Qing achieved in its entire conflict with the West. But while quicklime smoke rose at Human, in London, fury was erupting. Charles Eliot sent incendiary reports about British citizens being imprisoned, imperial property destroyed. Major trading firms, especially Jardine Matheson, lobbied Parliament aggressively. They didn't talk about opium. They talked about free trade, about national honor, about the need to teach the Celestial Empire a lesson in international law. Not every Briton agreed. William Gladstone, then a passionate young parliamentarian who would later become Prime Minister, stood in the House of Commons and called the coming war unjust and iniquitous, declaring he feared the judgment of God upon England for this crime. But the voice of conscience was drowned out by the clink of silver coins. He had won the battle at Human, but he had just opened Pandora's box, and what flew out was not hope, but a fleet. The letter to the Queen and the price of blindness. News of the opium destruction took weeks to cross the ocean. While London seethed with demands for revenge, in Beijing, the court was celebrating victory. The quicklime smoke at Human had cleared, but another fog, far thicker and more dangerous, still blanketed the entire forbidden city. Not natural fog, the fog of arrogance, the kind no wind could disperse because it was generated from within the mind of an entire system. The tributary system, the foundation of Chinese international relations for millennia, had no room for equality. When the British sent envoys, the court didn't see representatives of a powerful empire. They saw strange outsiders from afar coming to receive celestial grace. The most fatal mistake lay in language. In all official documents, the Qing court referred to the British as Yi, barbarians, uncivilized people, those lacking propriety from the borderlands. That single word determined everything. If they were barbarians, there was no need to learn about them. If they were barbarians, their weapons were merely exotic toys. If they were barbarians, their strength was temporary savagery, not civilizational superiority. And here is the detail you need to pause on. Read slowly. Feel the full horror of it. Lin Zexu, the most incorruptible, most intelligent official in the empire, a man even Dao Guang respected, wrote in his memorial to the emperor in complete seriousness. Westerners live on beef and bread flour. Without the tea and rhubarb of the Celestial Empire to aid their digestion, they will die of constipation. The fate of 300 million people rested on the belief that the enemy would collapse because they couldn't move their bowels. This was not merely a humorous anecdote. This was evidence of a total information disconnect between China and the world. Lin Cixu's letter to Queen Victoria represented the pinnacle of this cognitive failure. It was not a diplomatic communication between two heads of state. It was a moral lecture, delivered in the tone of a Confucian teacher scolding a disobedient student. He asked the queen about conscience and morality. His arguments were perfectly valid, but valid for the 12th century, not the 19th. The letter probably never reached Victoria, or if it did, it was treated as proof of the laughable arrogance of an empire that didn't understand the power of steam engines and long-range artillery. He asked the queen about morality, but in Britain of that era, morality always ranked behind profit and power. At the end of 1839, the British Expeditionary Fleet was assembled. 16 warships, 4 armed steamships, dozens of transport vessels carrying thousands of elite soldiers. This was not a trading convoy. This was a war machine designed to crush all resistance. When the fleet rounded the Cape of Good Hope, heading into the South China Sea, Lin Cixu was still training local militias and believing that the Humen forts were impregnable. He still believed Britain wouldn't dare start a war for fear of losing their tea supply. The gap between perception and reality was so vast, it could only be filled by catastrophe. When wooden junks met iron ships, an execution by technology. Summer of 1840. The sky off Guangdong was clear blue. Then, from the horizon, columns of black smoke began rising, drawing closer. The sentries on the forts rubbed their eyes. Not forest fires, not burning boats. The smoke rose continuously, steadily, without stopping, like the breath of a creature that had never existed in 5,000 years of Chinese history. The Nemesis, the British Empire's first iron-hulled armed warship, had arrived. The Nemesis was built secretly at the Birkenhead shipyard, commissioned privately by the East India Company. Nearly 60 meters long, iron-hulled, armed with 2 32-pound swivel guns and multiple smaller cannons. Draft of just over 1.5 meters, shallow enough to navigate any river. Maximum speed of nearly 10 knots, twice as fast as any Qing war junk. This was not an ordinary warship. This was a game changer. The military confrontation between Britain and the Qing was not a war between two nations. It was the brutal collision of two eras, the age of steam versus the age of muscle. This disparity was most clearly visible when you put yourself in the position of individual soldiers on the battlefield. From the perspective of a Qing soldier standing atop the Humen fort, an ordinary soldier, perhaps a farmer conscripted into service, perhaps a fifth-generation banner soldier who had never seen real combat, the picture was tragic. In his hands was a Kangxi-era matchlock musket, the same type his grandfather had used over a century ago. On the British ships, Royal Marines carried Baker rifles with rifled barrels and percussion caps, accurate at 300 meters. Before Qing soldiers could even see their enemy's face, they were already falling to bullets screaming through the air. But infantry weapons were merely the opening act. The heart of the war lay in artillery. Qing cannons, hand-cast iron, immovable on stone platforms, firing in only one direction. British artillery, rifled, breech-loading, firing explosive shells. At Chuanbi Fort, a single British shell struck a gunpowder magazine. The explosion shook the earth. Entire mud brick fortifications built over decades collapsed like sand. Then came the Congreve rockets, the most psychologically terrifying weapon. Long streaks of fire tore across the sky with blood-curdling shrieks. They hurtled forward, exploding amidst formations. Chinese soldiers called them devil fire dragons. On the water, the disparity was even more merciless. When the Nemesis entered the Pearl River, it needed no sails, defied the current, closed on Qing junks, and fired at point-blank range. In a single engagement, the Nemesis alone destroyed nearly 10 Qing warships in under an hour. Wooden junks were torn apart, burning fiercely, sinking to the riverbed along with thousands of sailors. Blood stained the entire stretch of water. The British suffered almost no casualties. This was not a battle. This was an execution by technology, the 19th century version of asymmetric warfare. The arrogance of the court had led to bitter consequences. For centuries, they had refused to upgrade their weapons, believing that ancestral martial prowess was invincible. But when facing ranks of modern rifles and artillery, the bravest Manchu cavalry became nothing more than targets. Lin Zexu, the incorruptible, upright official, had tried with everything he had. He purchased a few old Western merchant ships and fitted them with cannons, hired local blacksmiths to forge cannons based on British designs. He even hired people to translate Western newspapers to study the enemy, a rare effort in a court completely blind to the outside world. But it was all too late. A few defective cannons and hastily purchased boats could not substitute for an entire national defense industry that had fallen centuries behind. The cruelest irony? Lin Zexu, the only person in the court who tried to understand the West, was dismissed for provoking foreigners. Dao Guang needed someone to blame for the failures, and Lin Zexu became the scapegoat. He was exiled to remote Xinjiang, where he continued to serve the country in silence, building irrigation channels for local communities until his death. The most incorruptible official in the empire died in exile, while sycophants who reported fictional victories sat safely in court. That was the tragedy not just of Lin Zexu, but of the entire system. The British fleet advanced along the coast like a knife through butter. Dinghai, Xiamen, Ningbo, Wusong, then deep into the Yangtze River, threatening Nanjing itself. Every impregnable fortress fell within hours. Iron ships penetrated deep into the interior via the Yangtze, cutting the vital grain supply route from south to Beijing. The military collapse brought spiritual collapse with it. Soldiers began believing the British possessed sorcery, that iron ships were demonic creatures. Discipline dissolved. Generals either committed suicide to preserve honor or fled. At Zhenjiang, the most heartbreaking example, Manchu soldiers fought to their last breath. They killed their wives and children, then took their own lives rather than surrender. Their courage made even the British pause in respect. But bravery could not bridge the technology gap. They died with honor, while their country fell in humiliation. The First Opium War laid bare a brutal truth. In a rapidly changing world, conservatism is a death sentence. Iron ships and artillery didn't just destroy fortresses, they shattered the illusion of the Celestial Empire's superiority. When the British fleet formed battle lines before the gates of Nanjing, the sacred former capital, the economic lifeline, their gun barrels pointed at the ancient city. The court understood there was nowhere left to run. The velvet curtain of Tianxia had been torn apart by armored shells. Now the Qing was dragged to the negotiating table, where ink was mixed with blood and terms were written at gunpoint. End of Part 1. In Part 2, the treaties that chained a dragon. The burning of the greatest palace ever built, a century of humiliation, and the awakening that rose from the ashes. Thank you for watching the Dynasty Files. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who loves history.